Hello everyone, you're listening to the Earful Tower podcast. My name is Oliver G. This is a show that's brought to you by French Today audiobooks. If you visit their site, frenchtoday.com/earful12, you'll get a further 10% off all of their audiobooks. Why don't you go and learn French right now? Maybe it's your New Year's resolution. I'll be talking about them at the end of the episode. But first, a little bit of a reflection. This year is almost over. When I think about it, I realize a lot has happened. I'll talk a bit about that at the end of the episode. That's where I'll talk about everything that's going on. But when you get into that kind of reflective spirit, you start thinking about the history of the year. And you probably see where I'm going already with this. History is an interesting topic, even if you're an idiot like me. So with that in mind, we're going to do an episode about history today. I had the fortune of meeting today's guest, Mike Duncan, at my own book launch. Really recently we met. We'd been back and forthing on Twitter a little bit, and he came along to the book launch. It was lovely to actually have a chat with him there. And I said, you know what? I don't know much about the French Revolution, and I know you're an expert on it. Let me just put things in perspective. You'll hear it in the episode. I call Mike Duncan a titan on the podcasting scene. He has shows such as the history of Rome and revolutions. Revolutions might be what you're familiar with most recently. He's also written books. I'll talk about them in a second. But Storm Before the Storm and Citizen Lafayette is his current book. We'll be talking about that in depth at the end of the episode, but we get chatting, and I said, look, I don't know anything about the French Revolution, which is pretty true. And I said, do you think we could do an episode where you just explain it to me like an idiot's guide? And he said, Oliver, I'd be glad to. And that's what you're about to hear. He's going to condense the whole thing into about 30 minutes with a bunch of stupid questions coming in from yours truly. If you're a history nerd and you really know all this stuff, then skip this episode and go and listen to his own podcasts, which are absolutely fantastic. Or if you're kind of a dabbler in history like myself, you'll probably learn a thing or two in here. In fact, maybe you'll be able to guess some of the little sort of questions he puts to me before I try and answer them. Now, Mike Duncan, his show Revolutions, go and check it out. But first, here he is on the Eiffel Tower talking about the French Revolution. Mike Duncan, welcome to the studio.
Thank you for having me here in the studio.
And as I said just 10 seconds ago, I love your name.
Thank you very much.
It is simple, but it's, do you think it's kind of American sounding?
It is. It's very clear, concise, like Anglo-Scottish. Mike Duncan.
Mike Duncan.
Good 3-syllable name. It took me a long time to come up with it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, sure.
The hard K's is quite Viking-y, you know?
Thank you.
Duncan, Mike Duncan. Mm-hmm. That could be.
It's bold.
Yeah, it's bold. Yeah, if it was written, it would be in bold.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Mike Duncan.
But as much as we could talk about that all day, we got to. The idea is that you're going to talk through the sort of idiot's guide to the French Revolution.
But so your guide to the French Revolution.
Because I'm ashamed. I'm a little bit ashamed to say I don't really. I've seen the words flying around a lot. And I'm going to be totally honest with you, Mike, and with everyone. I don't really get it. I don't know what the fuss is about. I've never studied it, and I've never, had it, forced onto me either. I know that I feel like I know some dates, and that's about it. And I've seen a few movies, and I get them confused which one is the right one. And I'm going to lay it all bare, and you're going to help me and the listeners.
Well, what is the date that you know?
I'm nervous to get anything wrong. How about before we start, though, I just want to say for your credentials a little way, that people who don't know you, you're a titan in the podcasting industry.
I'm not a titan. I've been around for a bit. I'm a veteran.
What about in the history podcasting?
Okay.
Could we say titan?
I'm a titan of the internet.
I like it.
I'm a very big deal in the world of the history podcasting.
Right.
Yes, it's a true thing.
That's really cool. I'm saying titan. I'm saying titan in podcasting.
You are saying titan.
Everything's relative.
And then people can cite this episode when I'm referred to as a titan in my Wikipedia
Everyone's
page.
Everyone's going to be a titan in something, right? But so you're an expert. A lot of people who already, I'm sure some of the listeners to the Eiffel Tower know about your stuff, but usually you'd go much more in depth. But I asked you today to kind of tone it down. And if anyone wants the real in-depth stuff, they can check out your show.
The point of the show, the point of Revolutions, is to walk people through in pretty good detail all of the great political revolutions in like early modern history. And as the show has wound up, it's, it's European history and Atlantic history, because I've also done shows about Spanish American independence and the Haitian Revolution. And but the series that I did on the French Revolution was a 55-part series on the French Revolution that I will take you from beginning to end, and that covers about, roughly 10 years of French history over 55 episodes.
Wow.
So, yeah, we're not going to do the 55-episode treatment of the French Revolution right now, but the date that I think you would be grasping for would be 1789. Yes, you got it.
I feel like a lot of people use it for door codes.
1789 is a very famous date in world history because it's sort of the epicenter date of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is one of those, world historical events that is of profound importance for the whole world. It's not just it's not an obscure moment in French history or even European history. I think that the repercussions, the ramifications, the influence and impact of the French Revolution really has spread throughout the globe. Chinese revolutionaries will be talking about what happened in the French Revolution, for example. So that date, 1789, which is so profoundly important because, around here we have 14 Juillet, which, in America and the English-speaking world we call Bastille Day, becomes in the historical memory this great moment of impact. But the French Revolution as an event, in my mind at least, starts at least 3 years before that, right? Because the French monarchy faces a financial crisis, major financial crisis in about 1786 that needs to be solved. And that sort of starts the gears grinding on the breakdown of the Ancien regime into this revolutionary event. But then it will continue through what we think of as the revolution with the guillotine and with Robespierre, through to the coup of Napoleon, the arrival of Bonaparte and the arrival of Napoleon, and then the Napoleonic Wars follow after that. And Napoleon and Waterloo doesn't happen until 1815.
1815.
Right? He's looking straight up, trying to pull that number.
And let me just say something. So there's two things I have to say really quickly. I don't know how it happened, but at school I never had a history class. No, they never
taught you history?
No, I swear to you. So I moved around. My dad's job meant that we moved around a lot. And I don't know how it works in the States, but in Australia, there's a period when you're about 15 years old, where over 2 years, they kind of force feed you like a French goose, all the different things. They're like, try history, try drama, everything. And because I moved a lot in that period, I never was there for the history or the ancient history ever. I've never sat in a history class, right? That's a bit of an excuse. But the second thing is, usually before a guest comes into the studio, I'd read up a bit. But when we met at 2 days ago at my book launch, and we got chatting about podcasting, I said, I'm going to purposely not read up on this.
The idea is that you haven't done any reading at all. That's good.
I'm the idiot here.
Right.
And even when you say Robespierre and stuff and Bonaparte and stuff, I know, but I don't know the full story. And you said 10 years of revolution.
Well, that's the thing. So if you take this all the way out to the fall of Napoleon, then you're looking really at almost a 30-year period of European history that is consumed by this thing that starts with a financial crisis inside the French monarchy in 1786 and really doesn't end until, all the nations of Europe are having it out over Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. And then that revolutionary cycle, that period, which is about a generation long, can then be divided into its own little subset epochs. So you have the pre-revolution era, which lasts from the monarchy having this financial crisis, knowing they need to do reforms, knowing they need to figure out a way to solve taxation issues because the French monarchy was dealing with this problem where if you were rich, you didn't pay taxes. And if you were not rich, then you did pay taxes. And this turned out to be a really horrible way to generate revenue for the state because everybody who had money in Ancien regime France basically had an exemption from paying any significant amount in tax to the state. And they did have obligations. The state had obligations that they needed to meet. So the reason 1789 becomes this momentous year is because after 3 years of trying to solve their financial crisis and running into resistance, running into members of the aristocracy pushing back on the attempts by the king and his ministers to reform the tax system of the monarchy, the big pushback was, we're not going to do this until you call all the representatives of France into one place at one time. Essentially, we want something resembling a parliament. Like,
who's saying this?
Who is saying this? The aristocracy and also the third estate. So the Ancien Regime was divided into 3 social classes, okay? The first social class was the clergy, the members of the Catholic Church. The second estate was the aristocracy, so all your marquises and dukes and knights. And then the third estate was everybody else.
Right.
And the first estate and the second estate comprised maybe 5% of the population.
Sure.
Okay, so they were a very, very small upper nobility.
And they were having it good by the sounds of it.
They had it great.
Yeah.
Then the third estate is 95% of the rest of the country. And the problem is that the third estate now wants to have some kind of representation inside the state, inside the monarchy, to be able to say, you know, we have the right to contribute to this government. We have the right to decide what laws are being passed, what taxes are being levied on us. And up until that point, they had really been shut out of the decision-making process.
So it's kind of the people are, I'm sick of this. I'm sick of all this.
Very much.
Yeah.
They're very much sick of all this. And then what they're being driven by partly too is prior to the French Revolution, there's a generation that we would call the Enlightenment. The philosophes of France are running around developing new ideas about liberty and ideas about democracy.
And was this just
ideas about equality?
These are the people on the street, or is this the elite that are figuring all this stuff out?
No, this is coming from the educated,
right.
the upper educated class. So guys like Voltaire.
And and people coming from abroad as well, or is it just French people?
We're mostly talking about French people right now. There is a healthy, foreign contingent.
Yeah.
That's Paris has always been a very
is.
It's a very cosmopolitan city. But there are these new ideas. I mean, these ideas had helped fuel and contribute to the American Revolution, right? These ideas about liberty and equality and democracy are starting to come out. And so you combine those ideas that had been developed in the generation before 1789, then sort of jamming into and running up against this really immediate financial crisis and the desire for sort of the general public, for the people of France, especially for the educated people in France, to contribute and participate in the government. So the king finally has to back down and say, okay, we'll call everybody together and we will work out a reform package, political reform, social reform, economic reform. And if I get too deep into what happens when the Estates General gets called, we will be here for the next 12 hours.
You got to keep the idiot entertained as well.
But suffice it to say, when they all came together, there was immediately a breakdown because the aristocracy and the clergy attempted to do what they had always done, which is control the process and control events and be the ones who are the leaders. And they were now facing a third estate that was feeling very emboldened. And the third estate wasn't just going to be put in its little third estate box anymore.
It's kind of like the people got smart a little bit.
I think so.
Or they wised up and they're like, was I right in that you said that it was them paying all the taxes as well?
They were paying a lot of the taxes, yes, that the aristocracy was not.
So
paying.
If we're talking like podcasters, I'd be the third estate and you'd be the second estate.
No, I'm of the people. I'm third estate. I'm third estate all the way. No.
I'm just getting my head around it. Okay, so people like me and you were going, hang on, let's say it's me and you, not podcasters anymore. We're just people back in 1788, 89.
Yeah.
We're not happy with this.
We're not happy with
all
this.
So we're going, the aristocrats and the clergy, they're all rich. They're laughing. Look at the coats they're wearing.
Yes.
When I see them walking on Pont Neuf, and I'm walking in the gutter in my broken shoes, I'm assuming. So they go, let's make this fair. So why hadn't this happened in 1400 and was this happening everywhere in Europe and the world, or was it especially France that had this first big one? Or
this had happened previously. I think you could say that it happened in England before this because a lot of Stuart England, the English civil wars that surrounded Cromwell, which I talk about in the Revolutions podcast, right. I'll walk you through the era of Cromwell, is a lot the same thing where you have, King Charles I had been trying to rule without letting anybody else in on the game because he believed in his divine right to be the absolute ruler. Right. And all of these landowning members of the gentry and the upper middle classes said, we want to participate in this too. And this is really how Parliament in the UK becomes formed and becomes an important thing. This is 120, 130 years before the French Revolution breaks out. The difference being that at that time, the UK, they weren't even the UK at this point. They were just, the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, and Ireland. They were on the periphery of Europe. They were relatively small. They were not an economic powerhouse yet. And all of this coming through France, which really was a huge country with a lot of people and really was a very wealthy central city, central kingdom in Europe. The fact that this was all coming in through France made it a huge deal for everybody.
So people like France, I mean, does France have the same impact today, do you think? Like it's still, people still see it as a powerhouse, or was it kind of like the America of the 1780s?
No, France at that time was a much bigger deal than France is today. Yeah. That is definitely true. Yeah. And part of what turns them into really, truly a superpower is you go like, so we've gotten to 1789. There's this thing that then breaks down, and there's, there will be eventually mobs running through the street. They take down the Bastille. That's why we celebrate the 14th of July as this, we have planes flying overhead.
And that was 1789.
That was all in 1789. So there's very quickly this attempt at reform that collapsed into a revolutionary uprising out in the streets. I mean, we're sitting here talking now today in the midst of this, transit worker strike. And that history of the French people taking to the streets to force or to fight against changes or to fight for changes has its roots all the way back in the French Revolution. So I think that, these strikes that we're seeing today, the Gilets jaunes, before this, the Gilets jaunes are all in the grand tradition of something that emerges out of the French Revolution. So I say it's a global event. It's also a very, very important event for the character and stamping the French, who they are politically, economically, and how they relate to each other on a daily basis.
It's very dear to them as well. I remember talking to the author and the model Caroline de Maigret on the show about the first time I had her on the show, and I asked her, she'd just come from a rally or a strike. And I hadn't really thought about it so much before. And I said, the French, the strikes and everything. She goes, that's how things get done. I'm paraphrasing. You'll have to go back and listen, everyone. But she said it was thanks to the revolution that, France became France or something like that. And it made me kind of think, that was, people still talk about it.
Right.
This is huge.
Yeah, there's an unbroken continuum and an unbroken national identity. And, the national identity of France is something that is born out of the French Revolution. They were, before the Revolution, they were, like everybody else, they were a monarchy where there were kings and there were aristocrats, and then everybody else was a subject of the king. Sure. And the king was supposed to be this absolute ruler.
So who's the king now in 1789?
Louis XVI. And Marie Antoinette. So we got Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are the sort of the living symbols of this decadent, unequal society.
But he's not the famous French king. That would be the Louis XIV, no?
Louis XIV was Louis XVI's great-grandfather. Right. He's the one who built up Versailles.
Yeah, and that's when most people think French royalty. They probably think him and Marie Antoinette, even though they were never together or anything. Yeah,
they're two ends of a spectrum. Right. Where Louis XIV is the one who builds up Versailles and creates this opulent approach to monarchy, because the French kings go all the way back into the misty dark ages, but the idea of this incredibly opulent centralized monarchy and Versailles and everything that when people come to France and they come to Paris, they're going to go to Versailles, and what they're looking at is Louis XIV's expression of what he wants a centralized absolute monarchy to look like. And that is happening at the end of the 1600s and beginning of the 1700s.
Gotcha.
So now we advance to his great-grandson, who is Louis XVI and Louis XVI's wife, Marie Antoinette, who are going to bracket the other end of that opulent absolute monarchy, where what Louis XIV created, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI will see collapse and be destroyed. In part because they were living in a bubble.
Right. They're living in a bubble. They're rich. But here's my question for you. firstly, people from the time of Louis XIV must have been like, how dare he build that big castle when I'm living in squalor, right?
Well, the people in the streets certainly thought that.
Would they have even seen it?
No.
Okay, so they probably didn't even know.
No.
But then when they get angry with Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, I wonder why they didn't want to go and burn it to the ground. Why is it still standing today?
Luck.
You think?
I do. There is a moment in the French Revolution, so still in 1789, where you've had the Estates General have been called. They're trying to solve this financial crisis. There has been an uprising in Paris, which part of the reason why Louis XIV built Versailles and moved out to Versailles, which is a little ways out of Paris, is because he did not trust the Parisians. Him and the Parisians did not get along with each other. He got in fights with the leaders of Paris, and he didn't trust the mobs of Paris, so he wanted out. So they have this over the summer of 1789, there are all these revolutionary events that happen. This is when the Declaration of the Rights of Man is written and promulgated, which is still posted on every government building and in every school in France. You have the Declaration of the Rights of Man gets published. By October of 1789, things still haven't quite gotten any better.
But the Bastille has been stormed by this point.
It has been stormed by this point, but things still are not great. So there is a mob led by women. It's the Women's March on Versailles.
Right.
And they start at the Hôtel de Ville, right down there. Yeah. And they march all the way to the front gates of Versailles.
Right.
In a mass, all on one day in October.
Like 100, 1,000, a million?
Couple thousand, many thousands, tens of thousands.
Yeah. Why women?
There are a number of theories. One of them is that they were the ones who were pissed off that they couldn't get any bread. They were the ones who had to go wait in line for food, and they were the ones who had to feed their families. Right. And so they were really angry about this. And then also there were parts of French law that exempted women from being charged with certain crimes. So if you put women in the front of the march, then they weren't going to be they couldn't be charged. But the rage that was coming out of particularly the women of Paris was because they couldn't feed their families. Right. Because in addition to this financial crisis that's happening, there's also a series of horrible harvests, right? That's one of the things that contributes to the revolutionary event is that for 2 years in a row, there are terrible harvests in France. And so there are bread shortages. Prices are going sky high. People are having trouble feeding themselves. And there's no relief. There's no relief that's coming. So yes, you have these fancy people in their silken finery who are still cavorting around gluttonously throwing parties and balls.
Were they fat? Were they all fat, these aristocrats?
No. Some of Louis XVI was not svelte in any way that you would recognize today. But, I come from the United States of America. And so when I look at aristocrats from France in the 1700s, I'm not saying those people are fat. Right. I have a different conception of.
But if you think, I'm imagining in France a couple hundred years ago, people were typically quite thin because they were living
They were not emaciated the way that the people in the streets of Paris.
So by comparison to them, a typical Parisian would have looked at them and said, "Look at that plump, silky man,
who can always get food, and I'm having trouble getting food." Yeah. So a part of this march is to go. They're going to, and if you take a tour of Versailles, they will tell you all about this. They love telling this story because it's the end of the road for Versailles, where they break into the Versailles Palace. They break into Marie Antoinette's room. She flees down this secret corridor to try to find, because they're like, we're going to kill the queen. We're going to kill her.
They're out to kill the queen.
They're out to kill the queen.
Thousands of women chasing Marie Antoinette.
Right. And the person who steps into the breach to stop all of this is the good Marquis de Lafayette, who has been put in charge of this new sort of citizen militia called the National Guard, who also rides out there with the women.
So we're going to talk about Lafayette a bit later in more detail.
We
that's
can.
Important to you.
So what the event, the upshot of this is finally that Lafayette helps get in the middle of all this, and then the king and queen agree to relocate from Versailles to Paris. Right. And they put themselves in the Tuileries Palace, which at the time was still standing, which is in the Louvre complex.
Is that the fourth wall of the Louvre that burned down?
Right. They burned down by the Commune.
If you guys have visited the Louvre, you can imagine the pyramid. The pyramid's got 3 big walls around it. That's the Louvre Museum. There used to be a fourth wall where there's now a kind of Arc de Triomphe kind of arch. That used to be
the Tuileries Palace.
Exactly.
Right. And so that's where they installed them. Right. And from that point on, the king and queen are essentially captives of Paris. Right. They're prisoners of Paris. And that's the end of the line for the palace at Versailles. Nobody ever goes back there to live. And the fact that it wasn't torn down was really just nobody did it.
I wonder if
they
people were like,
they just kind of
it is
didn't do it.
beautiful, you know,
Right.
you know.
And eventually, it's Louis Philippe who turns it into like a national museum.
Yeah, right. That's further down the line.
Yeah, that's by the 1830s, 1840s.
Okay.
But it just kind of sat derelict. I mean, they kind of padlocked the door and
big gold padlock.
yeah. Yeah, and Napoleon thought maybe he wanted to live there, but decided it would not look good from a PR standpoint to install himself in the Versailles Palace.
Napoleon, when was he kicking around?
His coup that brings him to power is 1799.
So 10 years later.
Yeah, 10. Okay. So that's the thing. There's 10 years worth of revolutionary events that goes from, again, there's a financial crisis, and then the other part of it is this bread crisis, this there's starvation. That combines into a revolution that then rolls towards war with all of Europe, right?
And that's where
then there's a war. A war is going to erupt.
So the war begins is when we say the French Revolution ended?
I say that the French Revolution proper ended in 1794 when Maximilien Robespierre is overthrown because he was, they say I wouldn't say this as a historian. I will say this just as a general thing, that he's the architect of the Reign of Terror. That's not really true, but Robespierre is the one who is most associated with the Reign of Terror, which is 1793. So we're now, by the time you get to the Reign of Terror, you're 4 years on from when the quote unquote French Revolution started. Yeah. So there is one, sort of general misconception of the revolution, is that it was a very quick event, and that 1789 was the year that they called the Estates General, they rose up in the streets, they took the Bastille. Then they grabbed the king and queen, they brought them back to Paris, they killed the king and queen. Then there was a general reign of terror, and that all of this maybe took 18 months. Let's just say like the French Revolution was a very close, confined event. Sure. And actually it was this sprawling series of events. It was really an unfolding process.
I wonder what life was like at that time. It can't have been...
It was really stressful and chaotic.
I wonder if, even now we've got chaotic times in the US and the UK, politics-wise, which we're definitely not going to get into. But I wonder if, because a lot of people, I meet a lot of Americans and British people here, they go, not talking about that.
Right.
I wonder if you could do that back then, or if it was so affecting your ability to live that it was all you ever talked about.
I would tend to think that it would be closer to that than just you could ignore it. Yeah. There were areas. I mean, France is a big country. Sure. You could definitely live in some, in some other city and have it not necessarily be a big deal. But it was an all-consuming event. They were drastically reshaping how the government worked. They were drastically reshaping how the economy worked, and drastically reshaping social relations. Because I said, during the Ancien Regime, you're dealing with a king and subjects. After the French Revolution, you're dealing with a nation with citizens. And once you start telling people, and once people have really won for themselves, as I forget what her name was saying, that nothing gets done unless we take to the streets.
Caroline.
Yeah, there you go. They won for themselves the right of citizenship. Sure. We're not subjects anymore. We're citizens. Yeah. And so you do have people who, before the revolution, were nothing, now vigorously and violently defending what they had won for themselves, which is social equality, right? They brought down the dukes and the marquises and the king and the queen. They brought them all down to street level and said, just because I'm a baker doesn't mean I'm any less than you because you're a marquis. And that's one of the biggest things that the French Revolution truly achieves is égalité. Yeah. And I think I've spent a lot of time comparing the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And there is this, the liberté, égalité, fraternité triptych, which I tend to look at the American Revolution and the way that the United States then progressed. And the United States puts a lot of emphasis on liberty, right? The land of the free and liberty and all of this stuff. And that Americans will, if it comes to, are we going to be an equal society or are we going to be a society with free liberty, that Americans will tend to land on the side of freedom and liberty.
The land of the free.
Land of the free, right? This is a huge part of our national identity, is being the land of the free. Whether or not it's true or whether or not it's not wrapped in massive hypocrisy is a conversation for a different time. But in France, I think that they really landed more on the concept of égalité being more important than, and if you're going to talk about if there's a conflict between somebody's freedom and liberty and social equality, that they're going to land and defend the concept of social equality, which I think comes from the fact that they were living in this absolute feudal monarchy where everybody was a subject and then became a citizen. And that process of saying that nobody is better than anybody else, and that's truly the legacy of the French Revolution. We are citoyens, right? That concept of citoyen and equality is profoundly important to this very day, and it will always be profoundly important. I don't see it changing, certainly in our lifetimes.
So do you think, here comes an idiot question for you. Do you think, you said it was like 5% of people were in that top echelon or top 2 echelons or something. Let's say it's similar today. There's still a bunch of people who are extremely wealthy in France, right?
Right.
Do you think those people sit around sometimes? I assume the vast majority of French people go, oh, French Revolution, thank God we had that. Do you think there are people that sit around and go, it was better before the revolution, if only we were back then?
Yes, those people exist. I've run into them on Twitter.com.
You're very active on Twitter. What's your Twitter name so people can follow you?
Oh, I'm just at Mike Duncan.
Mike Duncan.
Yeah, I'm just Mike Duncan. Yes, you can find me when.
I said you're at Mike Duncan. I said you had a good name, but Maximilien Robespierre.
Maximilien Robespierre.
I mean, he takes you. Well, he wins it.
Right. So he's a third estate lawyer who winds up just sort of rising up through the ranks.
Good guy or bad guy?
Oh, that's a humongous question.
Really?
Trying to figure out. You can tell a lot by somebody's take on the French Revolution.
Really?
By what they think about Robespierre.
Interesting.
In particular,
That's
yes.
interesting.
Was he the sociopathic, murderous devil, or was he somebody who was simply willing to do what it took? And then you ask me, what do I think about Robespierre?
Yeah.
It speaks volumes for what I think about the French Revolution. Which,
Sure.
oh my God, it's a really complicated question. I can't just answer that.
Is he kind of one of the main characters of the whole thing?
Yeah, I would say so.
As well as Marie Antoinette and King the 16th.
Right, because Robespierre, especially at the end, in 1793, is the leader of the faction that wants to kill Louis XVI and wants to kill Marie Antoinette.
So they didn't die until 83 or something?
93, yeah.
Okay, 93, yeah, of course. So interestingly, everyone talks about 1789. That was the date that I knew. That's when most of the things happened.
Yeah, there's 1789 is a huge revolutionary year. A lot of things happen there.
And we said storming the Bastille without ever actually explaining it. Could you do it in 30 seconds?
There was a very large fortress on the east end of Paris that was, in people's minds, a symbol of political tyranny. In 1789, the people of Paris were afraid that the king was going to stage a counter-revolution using the guards and Germanic soldiers that he had at Versailles, that they were going to come into Paris and put down the revolution. There was a lot of gunpowder that was stored in the fortress on the east end of Paris, and so the people wanted to storm the Bastille, partly because it was a symbol of tyranny, but mostly because they wanted the gunpowder.
They wanted it for themselves.
They wanted it for themselves. They wanted that gunpowder to defend themselves against what they believed was going to be a counter-revolutionary, sort of counter-coup, reactionary coup by the king against the revolution. So they storm in there and they take it. And this becomes like the symbolic event of the French Revolution, is the storming, the capture of the Bastille, which involves a lot of people dying. And then they tear it down. The reason why it doesn't exist is because they did take that down.
They took that down.
Yeah, there was an order to tear it down, and it was done in about a year.
And it's been perpetually changing face ever since then. Even now, they're changing. It used to, I don't know if it is right this second, but it used to be a roundabout, and now it's going to be like a 3/4 roundabout.
It's going to be because they've completed that. At Nation. Right, they've completed that project in Nation, and they're doing the same thing.
Because they want to build more
great
green space.
Oh yeah. As a resident of Paris who doesn't own a car, I think these are the most fantastic decisions that have ever been made.
I've talked about it on the podcast before. I used to love going down to Bastille. I used to ride bicycles all the time, and I used to love riding around that because it was so chaotic and fun. A bit like the Arc de Triomphe, which you should never do on a bicycle, but the Bastille was fun because it was so chaotic. I'd close my eyes and scream and just go in circles. It was a wild time.
See, that's psychotic.
Yeah.
What I like...
That's how I got my kicks.
I want to be able to take my kids down there, and be able to walk without being afraid for my life.
I've got so many more questions, but we've already gone over time, so I'm going to do what I used to do a lot, which is quickfire round.
Okay, let's do it.
And this is unscripted, but it's going to be 5 questions. The rule is you have to answer quickly. You can't think. If you take too long, I'll cut you off.
Okay? All right.
So first question is there a movie that I should watch for the French Revolution that's fun?
There's a movie called Danton, starring Gerard Depardieu, that is fantastic, and you should watch it.
In French, I assume.
Yes. But it's, get the subtitled one.
Yep.
It's a great movie.
Okay, still on movies. Are there other... No, still on movies. What do you think of Les Miserables?
Les Miserables has nothing to do with the French Revolution that we have been talking about.
Irrelevant.
What do I think about Les Miserables? Yeah. The book or the movie?
The movie with Russell Crowe and
I've
Hugh
never
Jackman.
seen it.
Why not?
I've never seen it.
But it's...
you told me to answer quickly. I've never seen it. I don't have an answer for why not. I don't have a good answer for why I haven't seen it.
But that's another French Revolution that happened afterwards, I think.
Yeah, that's not even the Revolution of 1830. That is the failed revolt of 1832.
Okay. Talking about Paris, is there something that really gets your history juices flowing to see in the streets of Paris?
Is there something that gets my history juices flowing
I told you I
in
didn't script
the
the
streets
question.
of Paris?
You know what I mean? Is there something you look at and go, oh gosh, I'm glad I live here?
I live in the Marais, and I live quite close to the Hôtel de Ville. Mm-hmm. And the fact that when I'm just trying to go from one place to another, to get to the left bank, right, I'm constantly walking through the square in front of the Hôtel de Ville, which so many important things happen in that space. I mean, that's where Robespierre winds up dead. Mm-hmm. That is where the Second French Republic was proclaimed. That's where the Third French Republic was proclaimed. There were lots of really important things. That's where the Women's March on Versailles started from. So just sort of the fact that I have to walk through that to just go about my daily business is every once in a while I do stop and be like, I cannot believe that I'm just trying to walk someplace right now, and it takes me right through this
nice building too. You like the
building?
It's great. There's a listener to this show who works in there. Maybe I'll put you in touch with him.
I've been able to be in there one time because of the Patrie.
Patrimoine.
Ouais. So I took my son there, and it's really beautiful inside. I wish it was more open to the public, but there are reasons.
There's a guy who listens to this show who I always say that's my favorite building in Paris. I think it's beautiful, and he got in contact with me and took me through the whole building empty. It was amazing.
It's gorgeous because it's like Art Nouveau mixed with it's like neoclassical Art Nouveau is the interior.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful.
Amazing.
It's really beautiful.
A friend of mine became French. Mike, he might be listening. Became French and Australian guy the other day, and they did the ceremony in like a really ugly looking building on one of the islands in the middle. I was like, why don't they do the ceremony in the big, beautiful town hall? Wouldn't that be nice, the city hall? Wonder why they don't do that. This is a quick fire round, Mike. What have you got as an answer?
Why don't they do it?
Yeah.
Politics.
Gosh. Last question, and you can take a little bit longer to answer than quick fire round. You're working on a book about a man who this very street we're on was named after, Lafayette. What can we expect from the book, and why are you writing it?
I am writing a book about the Marquis de Lafayette because the Marquis de Lafayette was a principal player in 3 great revolutions. He was a young, happy-go-lucky teenager in the American Revolution, so Americans have a tendency to love him. Then he went back to France and was one of the principal participants in everything that we've been talking about in 1789. He was in the Estates General. He was the head of the National Guard. And he's, for a couple years in the French Revolution, one of the most important figures in France. And then he gets ultimately driven out by the Reign of Terror. Him and Robespierre didn't get along in the end. And then if you fast forward all the way to 1830, which is the July Revolution, which is the fall of the Restoration, the arrival of the July Monarchy, Lafayette played a role in that revolution as well. So he lived for close to 80 years, and in that time was a central player in 3 great political revolutions in French history and in really world history. And telling his story from beginning to end tells you so much that you need to understand about this humongous democratic revolution that happened in the entire Atlantic world, starting in about 1760, 1770, and lasting all the way until the 1820s and 1830s.
Right. You feel you're getting to know him a little bit as you're researching him for your book?
Yes, I feel like I know.
Do you think you'd be
he's my friend Gilbert now, right?
really?
He's not I don't call him the Marquis de Lafayette. I don't even call him General Lafayette, which is what he preferred. He's my buddy Gilbert now.
Do you think he's the kind of guy you'd be mates with if you were in those circles?
Yeah, I could get down with Lafayette. He was a good guy, I think. There were mistakes that he made, and there were, if you're a critic or an opponent of Lafayette, I have plenty of criticism for Lafayette, but compared to many of his contemporaries and many political figures that I've studied in my life, most of whom are cruel, greedy, ambitious, rapacious, many, many political leaders are borderline sociopaths because they're psychopathically egotistical and don't care who they have to run over to get what they want. Yeah, we see these leaders all the time.
Right.
And I don't really feel like Lafayette was that person.
But the book will cover all of this.
Right.
When can we get our hands on it?
You can get your hands on it it's still a ways out yet. It's going to be June of 2021.
Great.
So
That's more reason to follow Mike Duncan and everything he does. And thank you on a personal note, Mike, for coming along to my own book launch in Paris.
Yeah, well, I delayed Citizen Lafayette so as not to interfere with your own
That's very kind of you. And it's always fun to have a fellow Paris lover and podcaster on the show. So thanks for coming in. And I'll have to get you back on the show again at some point and we can talk about why you love all this stuff.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
De rien.
Well, there you have it. As I said before, Mike Duncan, he's a titan. We can say it. He's a titan on the podcasting scene. He's the writer and producer of Revolutions and the History of Rome. He has a book called The Storm Before the Storm. The full title of that is The Storm Before the Storm, The Beginning of the End of the Roman Republic. But he's currently working on that book, Citizen Lafayette, which sounds interesting and won't be out for a while. So as we said at the end of the episode, if you want to get reading something, pre-order his as soon as you can, but also pre-order a copy of my book. I'm going to switch it over to the book launch that I briefly mentioned in the episode there. So check out Mike. Everything he does is great. He's an expert. I'll have him on the show again. But in terms of something to do after that, why don't you go and pre-order my book, the Eiffel Towers book, Paris on Air. Surely by now you've heard about it. I've kickstarted the whole thing. It's pretty exciting on there. You can go to theeiffeltower.com/book is the easiest way to go and check it out. Maybe you're just interested to see how it's going on the old Kickstarter campaign. Maybe you want to order a book. Maybe you want to have a little bit of a shout out. I don't know. Go and check it out. But the other thing I mentioned at the start of the episode is that this show is brought to you by French Today. Now, what does that mean? Maybe you're new to this show. Maybe you're a fan of Mike's and you don't know anything about what I'm talking about. So let me spell it out for you. There's an audiobook company that'll teach you French. Its name is French Today. They've been the sponsor of this show for the whole year. Camille, who is, she's a French woman who is the voice of the audiobooks, but a whole lot more. She runs the company with her lovely husband, Olivier, and they run it from Brittany. So we're in northwestern France, and it's a small company. It's the two of them. They do a great job, and what they're offering you listeners is 10% off, a further 10% off. So if they're currently having a sale, which I think they are, that means you'll get even more. You just go to their website, frenchtoday.com/earful12. Now, first things first, Camille is going to be on the show in the coming weeks. I think I'm going to time it so that she can do a kind of Christmas episode for December. She's been on the show every month of this year, sharing tidbits and an interesting look into French, the French language, even the French mentality. But the interesting thing is their method for teaching you French. If you want to learn French beyond, I've said it before on the show, if you go to the class, the boring classrooms where they just sort of throw verbs, throw conjugations at you and hope that it sticks. If you want to do that kind of thing, you're very welcome to, but if you're anything like me, you'll find it boring and you'll tune out after 5 seconds. What's cool about Camille and Olivier's books on French Today, the audiobooks, is they're very engaging, they're interesting, they're relevant. They've got a whole method of teaching you French by the kind of things that you're likely to say when you come to France or when you meet French people. It's all about repetition, the study guides, learning the things that you kind of use through the format of story. You know what I mean? Rather than saying, hey, today we're going to concentrate just on the subjunctive tense, good luck, it'll tell you stories and it'll help you learn through repetition. It's the way that I learn French. It's the way that you should learn French. Please check it out, frenchtoday.com/earful12. Good luck in your French studies. Good luck in your history studies. And consider kickstarting, helping out my book, Paris on Air. theeiffeltower.com/book. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Thanks for this week. I'll be back again in another week. Au revoir.